Welcome to Mitcham Hills Church Online. My name is Merrin and it's great to share this time together with you. We're currently working through a series looking at the book of James in the Bible and a series on holiness with a W. Last week we heard from Rachel. Today we're going to hear from Cullen, who's going to be talking about faith that works. So we look forward to hearing from him now.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Cullen. It is a great privilege to be able to share with you this morning. We're looking at the letter of James. And there are two really interesting things about the letter of James. Firstly, James was Jesus' brother. Now, that might seem obvious if you know that, but the reality that James was Jesus' brother is really interesting for this particular reason. Younger brothers know a lot about older brothers, don't they? I mean, younger brothers know that older brothers don't always get it right. Now, if I stood up here today and said, I've got something to tell you, you might have been thinking this for a little while, but guess what? I'm God. You would laugh. But there'd be one person, my little brother Manning, who would be able to tell you that I am absolutely not God, right? Why? Because he's seen me at my worst moments. He's seen what I do when mum and dad turn their back. He's seen that one day I tried to sell him on the side of Dylesma Drive at Coromandel Valley to some strangers. I mean, he knows that I am not God, right? But James, all these years ago, not only did he profess that Jesus was God, he died for it. And we know that not just from the scriptures, we know that from the historical record. There was a Jewish writer called Josephus who wrote about James, and James got brought in about AD 60, so 30 years after Jesus had died, risen and gone to heaven, AD 60, James, the brother of Jesus, gets brought before a trial where they say to him, "Is Jesus God?" And he knows that the answer to this question will be life or death. And he says, yes, my older brother, the person that I saw in the worst moments, the person that I know the deepest, darkest history about, he is God. That's incredible, isn't it? And then he gets martyred. He's one of the first Christian martyrs. And depending on which version that you read, he either got thrown from a roof in Jerusalem or he got stoned. I mean, if you knew that this whole Jesus thing was just like a hoax, if you knew that he wasn't God, that you'd seen what happened behind closed doors, you might say it once or twice, but would you die for it? Like, would you die for it? So James has this really interesting perspective as Jesus' brother. The second reason I think the letter of James is so interesting is because of James's approach. James is a straight to the point kind of guy. So with the letters of Paul, and if you read Romans and there's some other letters that are in the New Testament, there's this beautiful framework that's established. He links the past to the future. He builds up in beauty and truth. He kind of builds this lovely story that sort of sends you to the heights of what this is all about. James just kind of sets it to you straight. He like machine gun stuff at you. He just kind of goes straight to the point. People that get straight to the point are really useful in life. People that warn you when you might be going on the wrong track are really useful, like James does. I had a cricket coach, and he used to say things to me like, you wouldn't want me to lie to you, would you, Cullen? I've got something to tell you, you're heading in the wrong track. Or he'd say this, I've got good news and bad news. Which one do you want first? I'd say, good news. He'd say, the bad news is, you're heading on the completely wrong trajectory. I'd say, what's the good news? And he'd say, I'm your coach. People in life that you and I can have that will warn us if we're going on the wrong path are very valuable, because there's a lot of people in our lives that will just let us kind of drift off and are too polite to say anything about it. They'll just sit back and they won't say anything. Even more annoying, there's people in our lives who, when we go on the wrong track and we've actually done the wrong thing and we're kind of headed down the wrong path, will say, well, you should have done that. They're not helpful. But people like James, who are kind of intricately worried about the path that we're heading on. As Rachel started sharing last week, James is interested in people becoming mature Christians. And he writes this letter in about 40 AD, and it's incredibly valuable to us. And we're going to get into why it's really important to us when it comes to our faith in action in a second. But just really quickly, when I was growing up, I thought the world was divided into kind of two camps. There was the faith camp, the people who believed in God. They were on one side. And on the other side was the non-faith camp who didn't believe in God. This is kind of how I conceptualise the world. And the faith camp were trying to kind of convince the non-faith camp to come over to the faith side, believe. And the non-faith camp were trying to sort of poke holes in the faith camp and say, look, it sounds all nice and it's all lovely, but it's not really real and that sort of stuff. So come over to the non-faith side. And that's how I kind of conceptualise the world. What I've realised as I've grown up is that's ridiculous for these two reasons. Firstly, everyone has faith. Everyone has faith. No matter what kind of your religion is on the census, no matter what your kind of background is, everyone has faith. Even someone who would call themselves an atheist, who doesn't believe that there's anything beyond the material world, that would say there's no spiritual realm, they're taking a step of faith. What's the step of faith? The step of faith they're taking, this is not what this morning's about, but just bear with me. The step of faith people who are atheists take is that everything they see, everything they feel is just a random accident. There's no meaning, even if they feel meaning in their loving relationships, it's just accident. People who believe that if I follow my dreams, I'll find true meaning, what have they got faith in? They've got faith in their dreams, giving them meaning. If you believe in your framework of life is if I work hard and I do all the right things and I don't commit any crimes, that the world will pay me back, well, you've got faith that if you work hard, things will pay you back. So it's not a case of there's the faith side and the non-faith side. Everyone's got faith in something. But the thing that James talks about, which is of most interest to us today, is this. There is living faith. Within the Christian realm, there is living faith and there is dying faith. This is the harsh reality. There is living faith and there is dying faith. And what he's so concerned about, which is what we're looking about here in these first two chapters of James, is that for some of these early Christians, they were believing all the right things, but there was no doing. They were believing that Jesus came back from the dead. They were believing all the right things, but there was no doing. And what that was leading to was the death of their faith. Very serious thing. Believing and not doing. This shouldn't surprise us because it's incredibly logical. It's incredibly logical. For example, if I went around professing that kindness was really important, and I believed that kindness was really important, but then at every kind of crossroad in life, you witnessed me choosing meanness over kindness, you might let me get away with that once or twice, but sooner or later you just say, well, the words you're speaking, they just don't relate to your actions, do they? I mean, your words don't relate to your actions. And then sooner or later you'd say, even though they say it, I actually don't think they believe it. And the power just kind of falls away, doesn't it? If you don't act in line with what you say, in line with what you believe, everything just eventually falls away, doesn't it? And James is saying here, and this is really confronting to all of us, James is saying, even if you're a person of faith, even if you believe all the right things, if you don't do the to-doing part of faith, it starts to disintegrate. It starts to die. Now, you might be here this morning and you're still exploring the whole Christian faith. You might be coming back to church after a little while, or you haven't been involved, or you're asking lots of good questions. And this morning you might have a story that says, the reason I left the church, or the reason I left a community of faith, was because of this. Was because there were people who were standing up in positions like I'm standing up, or worshipping in ways like we worship, and saying that they believe this, but then not doing it. There was a lack of consistency. They had the loveliest worship services, and they had the best words, and they had these nice things. But when it came to the doing part of faith, it didn't line up. Or alternatively, you might have a different type of story. And your story might be this. Your story might be, it was because someone did the to-doing part of faith that I came back to church. And I asked the question, if that's how they behaved, if they stepped into the space when I was at my worst moment, when I was hurting, when I was in pain, and they stepped in, what does that mean about what they're saying and what they're believing? That might have been the reason you came back. So this is really important. The to-doing part of faith, not just belief in itself, but belief plus action, according to James, is incredibly important. Now, as I mentioned, James kind of gets straight to the point. He's almost like a footy coach at quarter time, who's kind of giving like a hard message. He's like, come on, You've got to lift. Now, most footy coaches at quarter time or half time or three-quarter time, unless it's the Crows last night, in which case you just kind of keep going, guys, you're doing a great job. Most of the time, so, apologies. Most of the time the footy coach is like, come on, more effort, try harder, okay? But James isn't like that. Because action is always related to the heart. The first song that Grace chose today, From the Inside Out, our actions are always a reflection of what's going on inside us. Isn't that true? Our actions are always a reflection of what's going on inside us. And in the first part of James, which Rach started covering off on last week, James gives these three kind of snippet stories, which I think are all about the state of our hearts that really matter, that can influence how we act in the world. That's what I want to look at today, these three little snippet stories in the first part of the letter of James. And the first one is this, it's in verse 5 and 6, and it's up here. So I hope people can see that. But basically it says, when you ask, so James says, if anyone lacks wisdom, ask God and he'll give it to you. But this is critical. When you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. Now, those just go back one up, Alea, thanks. Those italics are my insert, because the word doubt here, because if you just read this, you're like, I've got to believe and not doubt. Well, everyone doubts. I mean, when you pray, you kind of doubt is an important part of faith. Like, it's actually like checking off, is this real? Do I believe this, right? Doubt's important. But this is where the Greek and English translation just doesn't really land it, because the word here for doubt, we see as kind of intellectually not sure. But actually what it means is to be separate from. So James is painting this picture where he says, when you ask God for something, when you say, God, could you please give me wisdom? In the very next breath, don't divide yourself and stand over this camp and say, well, it probably won't happen, so I'm going to plan over here. What he's saying is, when you ask God for something, stand on with 2 feet firmly that you trust in the outcomes of God. This is not an easy thing to do, but this is what James is saying. Don't be double-minded. Don't split your loyalties over 2 parts. Now, double-mindedness, I've been thinking about this word all week, because I think it's one of the great challenges that we face, especially in this generation that we're in, where we are constantly attention is distracted, where we're constantly called to be in kind of 2 places. There was a real wrestle between 2 people this week in our household. Evening Cullen and Morning Cullen had a real clash this week over a Netflix show. And it was this really interesting show that Heath recommended called, I think it was you, Heath, that I'm blaming, called Department Q. Has anyone seen Department Q? Great show. Every night at about 11 p.m. there was this struggle between Evening Cullen and Morning Cullen, because Evening Cullen, he thought it would be important just to watch the start of the next episode, because don't you think it's always better to sort of watch the start of the next one so you kind of get a few things resolved and you can sleep, right? Because they leave you hanging. And so Evening Cullen thought it was a good idea to maybe push on into the next episode, knowing full well that Morning Cullen thought it was a very, very bad idea. And that actually it would probably make life very tough in the morning, because Morning Cullen would be very, you know what I mean. Evening Cullen, Morning Cullen. There's a tussle. There was like a double-mindedness. Now that's a trivial example of the way that us human beings find ways to have feet in multiple camps, don't we? I mean, you see it all the time. You see these 35, 40-year-old guys who want to be married with a family, but also have a foot in the kind of bachelor, kind of live like I did when I was 21 kind of camp. And it just doesn't end well, does it? Or you got people who, you got people who want to kind of be in 2 camps all the time. You know, you're having a conversation with someone and one part of their brain's on the conversation you're having with them, and the other part's on the little kind of screen in their pocket and what's going on there. And there's sort of this split attention, isn't there? Now, what's James saying here? He's saying, don't be double-minded in life. You've got to make a call at some point. Are you going to trust God with the outcomes of your life, or are you not? And that's the first part of the puzzle. The next part comes a little bit further in chapter 1, I think, in 23. And Rachel talked about this last week, and it's a very interesting image. James says this: anyone who listens to the word but doesn't do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror And after looking at himself, he goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. You know, Tim Keller, who's a preacher from New York, or was a preacher in New York, he had this saying. He said, the Bible doesn't just tell us what to do, it shows us who we are. Now, isn't it interesting, this idea that James uses this concept of a mirror? Now, why is it important that when we look in the mirror, we see something about ourselves? Well, as you see in James a little bit that Merrin read to us earlier, he's very concerned about something that's going on in the communities that he's witnessing. Do you remember what it was? Favoritism. It's very challenging because, I don't know about you, but I'm kind of programmed to make quick judgments. If I get in a lift with someone, I make assessments on them. I make sort of judgments of them, and it's a very, very hard thing to do, to not do that, to not have biases. No matter what your kind of background is, no matter what your worldview is, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. To not judge and not be biased. And I'd almost go to the point where I'd say, it's almost impossible if you don't have an accurate kind of biblical view of who you are as a person. It is very, very difficult to change that. Why? Because if you think that whenever you reach out and help someone, it's because you're kind of more morally superior than them, and you're reaching down to help them. If your version of action in the world is kind of reaching down to help people who are poorer than you, that haven't made as good life decisions or pulled themselves up by their bootstraps in the way that you have, it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult to do what James says, to not play favourites. What's the only way that you can possibly get to a place where you're not judging people, where you're not being biased towards people, where you're not just acting in charity in a moral superiority fashion? It's only by this concept of the mirror. That when you read the scriptures, you don't see yourself as a superior person, but you actually see yourself as a person who is in desperate need of mercy from God. You know, a few months ago, we looked at the Good Samaritan. I don't know if you remember that. And we looked at this parable that Jesus teaches about the Good Samaritan. And do you remember that the scholars, a lot of the Bible scholars, when they look at the story of the Good Samaritan, believe that Jesus was kind of tricking the audience in the way he told the story, because for the first half, the audience were seeing themselves, projecting themselves into the story as the Samaritan helping the poor person on the ground that had been injured. But halfway through, the audience would have realised, because of the way that the story was told, that actually Jesus was trying to get the audience to see themselves not as the Samaritan helping, but who? As the person on the ground, in need of mercy and help. When we look at the scriptures, when we study the scriptures, we don't just learn about God as much as we do. We don't just learn about what we're meant to do as though there's sort of these rules to follow, but we actually realise that we are people who need mercy and who need help. And without a God who reaches out and helps us, we are nowhere. Only when we get that image in our minds are we truly able to reach out in mercy to others. So the first thing we're meant to do is to stop being double-minded and decide what we're standing on and trust God with the outcomes. The second thing is to look in this mirror and remember ourselves. And then the third thing is really direct and interesting, as James always is, in verse 27. Aaliyah, goes to the next one. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. You know, James brings these two different kind of concepts together and says, and we've got to remember the context here. So this is AD 40. Jesus is gone for 10 years. There's these early Christians that are essentially, if you thought about it in a historiographical session way, are moving from Judaism to Christianity. And they're trying to work out, what are we meant to do? Are we meant to offer sacrifices? How are we meant to worship? And all these sorts of things. And James is saying, put your focus on these two things. Put your focus on these two things. Firstly, helping the people in your community who are struggling the most, number one. And then keeping yourself from being unpolluted by the world. Isn't that interesting, those two ideas coming together? Because oftentimes there's this idea, both within kind of church faith, Christian faith, but also in the world around us, that the path towards kind of holiness, the path towards wholeness, is actually kind of getting away from all the stuff that's holding me back. if I could just clear up my schedule a bit more, if I could just have a bit more me time, if I could just kind of have that holiday where I can just get away from all the rigours and all the work. James says that's not the path to wholeness. That's not the path to holiness. This is the path. Looking after people, helping people, as Leslie talked about her mum, being someone that was available for people to help them when they're in their neediest moment. And that's the way that you move towards holiness. It's sort of strange, isn't it, that within churches, there seem to be churches who are really good at the first one. You know, they're really good at kind of getting together and helping meet needs, and they kind of go down that path, and it almost becomes like a sort of a social political movement in some senses, and they kind of seem to forget the second part, which is kind of holiness and worship and trying to keep things kind of clean, if you like. So there's dirtiness and there's cleanness. And there are other churches who are really good at the second one. They have great Bible teaching, and they have parenting courses, and they have a whole bunch of good things, but they kind of forget the first part. But James says it's through putting these things together, that you have a religion that actually is presentable to God. Probably no one in the last few hundred years has done this better than a guy called John Wesley. And John Wesley is kind of the forefather, if you like, of Methodism, which is the movement that we're sort of broadly a part of, if you like. And John Wesley had this interesting saying. He said this, there's no holiness but social holiness. There's no holiness but social holiness. And that our action, and when we're acting out, when we're helping people, is the way through to holiness. And he had a lot of people that used to write letters to him, and this one particular letter that was preserved was from a very rich lady in London in the 1700s. And she'd just had some very good health news that basically she had far more years to live than what she thought. And so she wrote to John Wesley and asked, what do I do with these years ahead? And this is what he wrote to her. He said this, the lengthening of your life and the restoring of your health are invaluable blessings. But do you ask how you shall improve them to the glory of the giver? And do you really want to know? I'll tell you how. Go and see the poor and sick in their own poor little hovels. Take up your cross, woman. Remember the faith. Jesus went before you and will go with you. Put off the gentlewoman of society. You bear a much higher character. John Wesley understood that in the years that we have, in the resources that we have, in the capability and the capacities that we have, that the path towards holiness and to a whole life always runs straight through a line of the actions that you and I take to reach out to people around us who are in need. Always. Tim Winton is one of Australia's best writers, best fiction writers. And a few years ago, he shared the story of kind of how he became a person of faith. And when Tim Winton was 5 years old, his father was in a terrible car accident and came home and was very immobile. And Tim had no brothers or sisters. It was just him and his mum. And his mum had a lot of trouble moving Tim's father around the house. And one day, as Winton recalls, I'm sort of reading from a story that was written about this. Winton recalls his mother got a knock at the door, and it was a guy called Len. He said, "G'day, my name's Len. I heard your hubby's a bit sick. Is there anything I can do to help?" Len Thomas was from the local Church of Christ, Winton explained, and he'd heard about the family's difficulties and wanted to help. He just showed up, continued Winton, and he used to carry my dad from bed and put him in the bath, and he used to bathe him, which in the 1960s in Australia in the suburbs was not the sort of thing you saw every day. According to Winton, that simple act of kindness from a single Christian had a powerful effect. It really touched me in that watching a grown man bother for nothing to show up and wash a sick man, it really affected me. This strangely sacrificial act, as he described it, was the doorway into the Christian faith for the entire Winton family. As a community at Mitcham Hills Church, we have incredible resources, we have incredible capacities, we have incredible capabilities. But wouldn't it be a shame if we wasted those opportunities to reach out to those in our community, in our lives, and in our world that are in need? James has a really clear message to us. If we want to have a whole faith, if we want to have holistic lives, it always involves that reaching out to the poor and vulnerable. But James says, don't just try harder. Think about your heart. Think about not being double-minded. Think about making a decision that you're going to trust all the outcomes to God. Think about who you are and what that means in terms of how you're able to act in mercy to the people around you and take action. We have an incredible opportunity as individuals and as a church community to live this out in a living, breathing and alive way. That's the call that James puts to us in this letter, and it's the call of Jesus to take up our cross and to follow him. Will you pray with me? Well, Heavenly Father, we don't always get this right, and we are inconsistent, every single one of us. We don't always do what we say we're going to do. We don't always do what we believe. And so we ask for forgiveness and grace for that. But we thank you so much for this letter of James. We thank you for the way it cuts straight to the point for us. We thank you for the way that it gives us a framework in terms of how we can approach action in the world. And God, we just, as a community and as individuals, we ask that we wouldn't have faiths that are dying, but we would have living faiths. And that you would actually show us situations this week and this month and this year that we can step into and act in faith. And so I just ask, God, by your Holy Spirit, right now you would be touching us, that you would be showing us, you would be giving us guidance into how we can do this, that we wouldn't just live for ourselves, but we would live for you and for others. And I pray this in the name of the one who ultimately did it all, Jesus. Amen.
Thank you, Cullen. And if it prompted you to think about something or it's stirring something in you, then please reach out and we would be more than happy to chat, pray with you. We're looking forward to continuing this series with Rachel talking about controlling your tongue. So stay tuned for that, and we'll see you next time.